yourself once again. My name is Shola Allard, and I am a fifth-year PhD student in electrical engineering. And I have the privilege of leading the panel discussion tonight. And joining us is Professor Tom Phillips, Physics Department, and Dr. Neil Shenvi of Chemistry, and Professor Bill Allard of Mathematics Department. Thank you all for joining us at GCF. So this past week, specifically on Tuesday, we had a very famous talk at Duke on faith and science. It was by Dr. Lennox. I'm sure we're all aware of this. We just thought that it would be time appropriate to continue that discussion for the benefit of some of us that couldn't make it in the hall. So I'm going to ask a series of questions and provide an opportunity for us to ask as well. Each person on the panel has the opportunity to answer each question. And whenever you do ask questions, I urge you you can direct it to a specific person or just anyone can pick it up. So my first question of the night is, we know that science at its best holds a strict evidence-based knowledge regimen. So how does your faith in Christ relate to that aspect of your discipline? In other words, I feel like as a scientist, I'm sure a good number of us here are scientists. As a scientist, I feel like science trains you to draw conclusions based on things that you can see, like phenomena that you can see, or maybe using physical manifestations of phenomena that we cannot see. And that by definition is anti-faith, really, because faith is the evidence of things that we do not see. So I'm thinking, how do you now reconcile those two dichotomies? Starting from
me first.
You.
I don't think they need to be reconciled because, in my opinion, that part of reality that science can deal with is extremely limited, and in particular doesn't concern the things that are most important. That's my opinion.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Things like values, the field of ethics cannot be touched by science. You can't tell whether something is valuable from science. It's not empirical. Things like logic, there are plenty of things that you just can't treat through science. I'd also say that I would just deny the premise that science is at its best evidence-based. There's plenty of fields of science that are just totally, they're not non-evidence-based, but you go way beyond the evidence. I'm a theorist. So I do math all day. I work on a computer all day. I have no idea what Tom does. You're instrumentalist, right? I break all your machines. I don't touch anything experimental. And so the idea that, well, science is only dealing with concrete realities, I'm like, well, what do? I'm a scientist. And so they're just huge fields where you'll never step foot into a lab, you never deal with concrete measurements even. And even things that you do, you're looking through a microscope at things that they're invisible. And your equations you have relate to things that you can't touch or taste or see. So I would just sort of deny the idea that science is always purely evidential. There's a huge number of assumptions that go into extrapolations that go on in science every day.
Before I let Professor Phillips contribute, do you think having data to back up a theory kind of gives you more credibility as a scientist? Don't you think that's the case?
Yeah, but if you look at, so I mean, this is somewhat controversial, but if you look at string theory, there are thousands of string theories out there. They don't have a scrap of experimental evidence. Nothing.
They're
In fact,
mathematicians.
Well, yeah. What did Dirac say? This theory is not even wrong. Like, that's how bad it is. It's not even wrong. So the only prediction they've made is off by like 100 orders of magnitude or something like that. So the bottom line is that when people make this naive statement like, well, scientific theories are based on evidence, like, they're not. Like, some of them are just totally not. I mean, or they're these wild extrapolations at least. So I would just say, certainly there is some set of things you want to explain with any theory. Right? You're looking to explain things that we actually can measure. But the theories go well beyond what we can measure. Look at quantum mechanics. In fact, measurement plays a special role such that most of quantum mechanics would say we can't actually measure the things we're interested in, like the wave function. But the bottom line is that in some ways it's very much like an evidential approach to Christianity. You have certain pieces of evidence that are, again, they're tip of the iceberg, but you say, well, what best explains this evidence? I have some evidence that Christ rose from the dead, or I have some evidence of an empty tomb, these appearances, whatever. What's the inference, the best explanation for that? So to extrapolate. I know things like love are meaningful, but that doesn't fit with naturalism. So how can the universe just be atoms and molecules and energy, and yet love is something, and justice and beauty, these the real things, doesn't fit atheism? So again, to say that science, or that even anything can be treated purely empirically, is false, even scientifically.
You're responsible for this, Phillips.
Let me take a slightly different tack on this. I am an experimentalist, and so evidence is very important.
I forgive you.
So, but let me make it clear that people don't all look at the same evidence and come to the same conclusions. All right, you can look at evidence, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of a paradigm. You have organizing principles that you use to interpret the evidence. And people can have different paradigms, look at the same evidence, and come to diametrically opposite conclusions about that. And so it's important for all of us to realize that we have paradigms, okay, and that we are using those to interpret the evidence, to interpret what we see. And generally we will try and find a way to make the evidence support what we already believe. Now I'm a firm believer that none of us have it all right, that we've figured it all out, we've got all the correct answers. And
gee, I thought I did until this moment.
But even when we acknowledge that we don't have it all right, when it comes down to any specific thing, we say, oh, that's right, I know that's right. Okay, and so one of the advantages I have, as I'm a particle physicist, and we, as particle physicists, acknowledge that we don't have the final answer yet. I mean, if we did, we would go do something else. Right? And so we have certain theories that we know break down at certain points. We have some fundamental theories that we believe in. Quantum mechanics is one, general relativity is another, but they don't play together. They don't fit together. They are fundamentally incompatible with each other. For those of you who are scientists, to all orders of perturbation theory, they don't fit together. It's not just the first order, it's all orders. Okay, so we know that stuff that we believe in is wrong. And so we're constantly trying to question our paradigms, question our theories, figure out what it is that's wrong. I don't think that's true in most fields. I don't think that they are willing to question their paradigms. And so trying to pull it all together, as Christians, we have a certain paradigm. We look at evidence and interpret it some way. Our friends and colleagues who are non-Christians have a different paradigm, and the act of conversion is trying to get them to understand that their paradigm is incorrect and to see it our way. On the other hand, we also have to be humble and acknowledge that some of the stuff that we believe is not correct. And so one of the things that I see for my life, the thing that unifies my faith and my science, is that there's things about nature that I don't understand, that I'm working hard, looking for truth in science. I'm also looking for truth in my understanding of God and religion. Okay, I see they're not incompatible. I see them as two aspects of the search for truth.
You actually just touched on my next question, which is, any of you, this applies to anyone, like, do you feel like there's a particular question about your faith that your scientific background has helped you to understand, or has there been a conflict between your faith and your beliefs and your scientific background? It's like a two-part question. Anyone can volunteer to answer first.
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay.
There's been no conflict. As to whether my science, and some people would not call mathematics a science. One has to give a definition of science, which would be very useful, by the way, but that would take...
Do you call mathematics science?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But it's different from some other things I would call science.
And that's what I was saying, is that the neo-atheists especially are really equivocal about the term science. By science they mean reality, or like truth. And then so anything that is not, but then also they mean empirical, experimental science. They equivocate. So if you say, well, I believe in God, they're like, it's not scientific. What do you mean? Well, God doesn't exist, so it's not scientific. But they're really equivocating on their use of the word science. So it's important to distinguish between different kinds of sciences.
The term is so equivocal, it becomes useless.
I had an atheist yesterday.
Discourses.
This guy's a third-year medical student ranting about how Christianity is false. But I said something about the law of identity, which is one of the 3 elementary laws of logic. And he goes, "What's that? Is it scientific?" I'm like, "It's one of Aristotle's 3 elementary laws of logic." But he's like, "Well, it's not science." I'm like, "Well, no, but it's true." I mean, but this guy, this is a medical student. I'm thinking, like, what are you learning? But it just shows you again, like, especially the neo-atheists are guilty of this. They have this idea that science is truth. All truth, science exhausts truth. There's nothing that's true that's not science, and there's nothing that is true that science cannot discover. Which, by the way, is self-refuting. It's called scientism, and it's false. It's demonstrably false, because you cannot... Never mind, I can get into it. But the bottom line is that you have to be very careful about how you define. There are different kinds of science, and so you should be careful how you define it. Sorry.
That's okay. I guess one thing I have personally struggled with is that, like in my field, before I can make a conclusion, I'm expected to present evidence to back that conclusion. So I feel like it's hard for me to be a rational thinker and also have faith. It's kind of like 2 opposite ends of spectrum. So I don't know if anyone here has similar struggles, or, for example, let's say I applied to 3 graduate schools, and one of them turns me down, And so I know that the probability of getting in is like lower, and and the other one turns me down. So that means the probability of getting to any graduate school is even lower. So I feel like having a scientific background kind of gets in the way of having faith. I don't know if that is true for.
I think that people may think that, but what they fail to realize, scientists fail to realize, is that they have faith also. Again, going to in my field, people have, well, it's become increasingly clear the more we learn that the universe is finely tuned for life. I'm sure many of you heard about this, that if you change any of the physical constants by just a small amount, that we couldn't exist as we are, that you couldn't have planets or stars wouldn't work or things like that. And so it used to be possible to believe that everything was just an accident. Okay, that is no longer possible. You cannot believe that realistically. The odds of it happening by chance are astronomically small. Okay, and so now the secular explanation for this is the multiverse. There have to be an infinite number of universes, all of them different, so that we map out all possible combinations of physical constants. And of course, the reason that we observe the one is selection bias. We can only observe the one where it's possible for us to live. Well, that requires a faith in an infinite number of universes that we can never observe. That is, to me, takes more faith than believing in a designer. Who turned the knobs, who created life. So
that infinity is very, very large.
it's incredibly large.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I just recommend everyone do is pick up a book on it's called Natural Theology. Basically, it's the arguments that exist to prove that God exists, just from nature, not from the Bible, not from just from philosophy, science. And you can make, like Tom alluded to, the argument from fine-tuning. It's incredibly powerful, and it's new. It's the last 50 years. It was discovered before,
Yeah, well, when I was your age, we didn't know all this stuff.
So in the last 50 years, the probability of, this argument that the existence of life is, 1 in 10 to the 500, 10 to the 123 or something like that.
It's bad probability.
It just, but we didn't know that until 50 years ago, and yet, some people have this crazy idea that science is slowly eroding. But anyway, I recommend pick up one of these books or listen to William Lane Craig's debates versus Kitchens or Zindler. But the bottom line is that there are really, really powerful arguments that just basically prove that God exists, unless you're willing to believe in a multiverse with magical fairies that live in one branch of the multiverse, which is literally true, right? If there are infinite numbers of universes, one of them contains unicorns.
To get a handle on what it means to have an infinite number of universes, that means that there's not only all the different universes, but this universe is replicated an infinite number of times. And so there's an infinite number of you sitting here listening to an infinite number of me's.
But in one of them, he has he's pink and he has a sombrero on. It's absurd. And so, again, when someone says you have faith, believe in God, I say it takes a lot more faith to not believe in God, at least with this, even one argument. The other thing I would say is that we've got to be careful not to let, again, the neo-atheists define the word faith. Sam Harris defines or science, right? But they define faith as belief in the absence of evidence. That is the definition of faith. You back to the Reformers, they defined faith in terms of 3 components: a sensus, notitia, and fiducia. So a sensus means becoming aware of the idea that, the gospel, Jesus died for your sins. sorry, that's sententia. A census is assenting to it, saying, I agree that this is true intellectually. The last component is fiducia, which basically is what we would call faith, trust. So when you counterpose, well, there's faith and there's evidence, or there's faith and there's fact, and that's not at all the case. Faith really is personal trust in something. So, for instance, a good example would be, my wife has demonstrated that she's trustworthy over and over and again. You said, well, how do you know she's trustworthy? Well, I can hear all the examples of things that she said she would do and she did them. I have all this evidence, right? And yet, I could still choose not to trust her. I could say, well, yeah, but I just don't trust you. And the evidence would not be enough for me to put my trust in my wife. Right? In the same way, we have lots of evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, the Bible is true, and we can still have faith, because faith is not about intellectual belief. In fact, the demons have faith, James says, and shudder. They intellectually believe the gospel is true, but they hate it. And so we have to be careful not to think faith is, again, belief in the absence of evidence. Really, faith is personal trust that is actually can be substantiated by the evidence, but will never be reducible to the evidence. You cannot argue anyone into faith, because they can always say, I refuse to believe, I refuse to trust in this, I hate God. Which is, again, I've seen it in person. You can bring a person to the point where they say, okay, I believe that maybe some kind of deistic God exists, but I hate him. I don't want nothing to do with him.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Father. At this point, I will throw it open to the audience. If anyone has any question about what's been said, you're welcome to.
One comment which I think you touched on is that, in fact, doing science also requires faith, because when you make a model of the physical world around us, in fact, it's not exact reality, it's our closest approximation to describing the reality that we observe. And in some instances, that may actually be wrong, maybe turn out to be wrong later. For instance, recently someone claimed that actually they found particles that travel past the speed of light. And I don't know if that still stands to the test of their experiment, but that's sort of understood as a law of nature by many people who do science. But it also goes to show that maybe next year someone could do an experiment and it could be shown that actually that's not a law of nature. And so it's really only true until you've proven otherwise. And so you have to accept that, okay, the speed of light is a fundamental constant on your faith as well, as you take the evidence for Christianity and accept that as your faith. And so it's not, like you said, science is not absolute truth, it's just our close approximation to what we observe.
Do you care to comment on that, or do you accept
I go beyond that, because when you do physics, when you do Newtonian physics, there are certain metaphysical assumptions you're making, namely that the laws of physics aren't going to change in time. So why should you drop something, S equals 1/2 t, at squared or whatever it is. Maybe tomorrow it's going to be t to the 2.000139 or something. So the assumption that nature is regular is it's an assumption, pure and simple.
Well,
And
you can also argue
we all have faith that things are regular. Otherwise, we go crazy because we can't deal with chaos and irregularity. But the fact is, we can't prove that.
No, but it appears to be an empirical fact. Okay, it's
For
an
now.
observation.
For now.
Yeah, but it's also subject to test, and we do that. We can look back in the universe just by looking at very distant stars. And they're now looking and saying, well, it looks like if you go back, 10 billion years, the fine structure constant was off by a little bit. So these are actually testable things, and so you don't need to have faith so much as you can measure, and then you have evidence that this is true.
You can still, for instance, you could say, how do you know the universe is, the constants are all the same in places you haven't measured yet, that you never measure?
Well, my approach to that is that the only things you know are the things that you've measured.
Right, yeah, but
Okay.
but no one is crazy enough to say, I think G is 10, on the backside of Pluto.
That's right.
But the point is, again, how do you, I think the game to play with skeptics is to push them and say, well, I'm really a skeptic. Prove to me that you exist. They say, well, look, I'm right here. I could be dreaming. Like, if you really, all of us have these faith assumptions that everyone accepts them, everyone around us. If we were in the Middle Ages, like, one of our faith assumptions would be that witches exist, right? But we just can't go, if we really are skeptical, really deep skeptical about these common assumptions, we'll find that there are all sorts of things that we can't prove, that we just assume, right? He's an experimentalist.
Yeah, I'm an experimentalist. Well, the approach that I have is, there's, why are theories useful? And they're useful because they tie together, using mathematics generally, they tie together different kinds of observations. Okay, and they're predictive then to tell you that, we have never measured the gravity on Pluto directly. Okay, but we've measured the gravity here, we've measured it on the moon.
Well, we've observed the orbits.
We've observed orbits. Okay, and so we are completely confident that if we went to Pluto, and did a gravity experiment, we would know the answer. Okay, that is, shall we say, faith in the theory based upon a large amount of evidence that supports it, that ties it all together.
Well, it's also an extrapolation.
But yeah, it's not proof. I mean,
well, it depends on what you mean by proof, and
maybe examples.
I don't agree that it's an extrapolation.
Well, no, because
It's a prediction.
It's a prediction.
It's not the same.
But
and there's absolutely no reason to believe that prediction is wrong. Okay, now let me give you an example from my work. Okay, one of the experiments that I want to do is to measure gravity on antimatter. Okay, no one has ever actually done that directly. I have not been able to get funding because physicists believe that in general relativity, which tells them what the answer is. Okay, well, this is a test of general relativity, and it is an extrapolation because it's in a regime that no one has ever measured before. Okay.
I'd like to, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd like to give another opportunity to ask a question or two. Nathan?
I'm just going to pull us away a little bit from the science. Even though it's great. But I just want to know what all three of you, think of the rhetoric being used by both sides on this debate, and if it's helping society understand that religion and science can coincide.
Sorry, would you repeat the question?
Is the rhetoric helpful? You're saying?
Yeah, is the rhetoric?
What's the rhetoric on the Christian side? I'm curious what you're.
Well, I think there are some, like the anti-evolution type arguments. Obviously, are a lot of the scientists essentially are saying that that evolution is a proven fact, and there are a lot of Christians who find that to be something they can't budge on. Like that type of attitude, I don't feel is helping us get anywhere in this problem of science and religion clashing that we've had since.
Which attitude are you talking?
I think both sides need to be able to listen.
There's more than two sides.
Yes, I agree. Right.
So both sides
there's more of a spectrum, obviously. But I was just wondering, what do you think, from your perspectives, the issues are there?
Okay, I am an anti-Darwinist. That requires a very careful definition, by the way. Okay. And in the sense of my definition, so is John Lennox, by the way. I am also an I hate to use the word fundamentalist because it's been misused for the last century, but there are many of our co-religionists who are ignorant, plain and simple, and they need to take the trouble to at least find out what it is they're disagreeing with. So, pox on both their houses. No, I'm dead serious.
So,
And I'm willing to talk at length to anyone about it.
Let me say the same thing in different words. Both sides are wrong, okay, and it makes it real easy, coming from either side, to look at the other side, know that they're wrong, okay, and therefore never question your own beliefs. All right. And so both sides are doing that. They're talking past each other. They're never going to get anywhere. They're not going to convince the other side. Okay, you people, okay, are in a position to recognize that both sides have it wrong, okay, and get much closer to the truth.
One last question, Adi.
I had a question about your thoughts on other faiths and whether you sort of saw Buddhism, Hinduism, and other things as grappling with the same truth, kind of like the blind man and the elephant. Everyone closes their eyes, reaches out, and calls it a different thing. And kind of a question that we posed to John Lennox of why Christianity then for you as science.
I can tell you a funny parable. 5 wise men walking through a blind man walking through a jungle, and one grabbed a tree trunk, and one grabbed a pipe, and one grabbed a rope, and one grabbed a leaf. But a wise man told them, "You're all holding an elephant."
Right.
Yeah. And so it's in a reply. And so I think that are all religions in some sense trying to find spiritual truth? Yeah, I think so. I think the big issue we have to settle is there a revealing God? Does God, if he even exists, could he possibly be a God who reveals himself and who's a God of particularity? And I think that question is just totally glossed over. You would just assume the answer is no. And I'd say, well, that's a big assumption. What if, how do I know that Mormonism or Islam or Hinduism? Well, I guess Hinduism and Buddhism do not have revealing gods. But I would say the major monotheistic faiths do. And so I'd step back and ask that question first. Why do you believe that there is not a God who reveals himself? Not that we're searching for, but that we're searching for us. And if you say, well, there's not a God like that, well, how do you know that? And then if the answer is yes, well, then the question now becomes, well, which religion has he revealed? So I think, again, you have to really probe the question behind the question when you're asking that.
Any other contributions?
Let me defer the answer there to someone who spent a lot more time looking into the question, and that is Hugh Ross, who's the founder of the organization Reasons to Believe. When he was a teenager, he actually came to the conclusion as an astronomer that the universe had to have been created. He then asked the question, okay, is the God someone who's tried to contact us, and came to the conclusion, well, if he has, then you would find that in a holy book. He actually went through the religions of the world, through their holy books, looking to see if they had obvious scientific, demonstrably wrong statements. And throughout the holy books until he came to the Bible, which he saved for last because he knew it would be the hardest. And what he found with the Bible was that, as opposed to most of the other books which had very nebulous statements, it was hard to get any facts that you could actually test from those. Okay, the Bible was very specific, okay, and did not have contradictions in it that he could point out and say, this is scientifically incorrect. Okay, and so on the basis of that, he came to the conclusion that the Bible was in fact the true revelation, the true Word of God.
He tells an interesting story. I think he was at a talk by Carl Sagan. And Sagan was talking about how we need to start funding SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, looking for aliens, because our human race is tearing itself apart with war and disease and famine. And we need to find aliens who will give us some clue to how to fix life and how to live the right life. And we really need like some kind of Encyclopedia Galactica and there's some kind of, you guys are familiar with Asimov, but so that they'll give to us to like solve our problems. And Hugh Ross leans over and he goes, he's talking about the Bible. And Sagan, I think it was Sagan hears him and he goes, "Sir, I'm not ready to accept the implications of that book." It's a very interesting insight into the guy's.
Sagan.
I don't know if it was some famous astronomer. So it might have been Sagan, it might not. Is it Sagan or Sagan?
It's Sagan.
But I thought it was an interesting insight is that we say, oh, man search for God. C.S. Lewis describes it as you talking about the mouse's search for the cat. We don't really want the God, any God. We don't want the God of the Bible. We want a nebulous God, the elephant God.
We all have our own ideas of God, and people who say that they don't believe in God, you can ask them, okay, what God is it that you don't believe in? Because the chances are I don't believe in that God either.
You had your hand up.
Oh,
Jennifer.
I'm always curious, talking to fellow scientists who are Christians. I think we as Christians get trained a lot on how, you're a scientist who's a Christian, go into your scientific realm and be a Christian to them. But do you have any kind of thoughts or personal experiences that you want to share about kind of going the other way and being a scientist on demonstration for Christians, that kind of getting back a little bit to Nathan's talk or question about, Christians who just kind of turn a blind eye to science for whatever reason or whatnot, but kind of dealing with that tension, kind of going back the other way, and in some cases being one of very few, scientists in a Christian community or something like that.
When going back from where?
In the Christian community.
In being a scientist in the Christian community,
church.
Say like in church or in your families or things like that.
Yeah, when you say Christians among you suggested, and I agree with your suggestion, that Christians among scientists are a rarity. But in fact, according to the few surveys, I admit it's a few, when you look at the ratio of Christians among scientists, it turns out to be significantly larger than the ratio of Christians among intellectuals in general, in particular among social scientists.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's a responsibility to educate, as Christian lay people, to participate, especially in the education of in general education.
Yeah, it can be a tricky business, right? Because there are some people who are just adamant in their belief that in order to be a Christian, you have to believe in 7 24-hour days of creation. Okay. The first thing I try and get across is that, look, there's things we can disagree on, okay, and still be saved. All right, and that is one of them. Okay, that is not something that's on the final exam. You don't have. You can get that wrong and still go to heaven.
How do they make up the final exam?
One last question of the night, and this is going to be a very short one, like maybe 2 minutes each. At what stage in your life did you become Christians? Because you are all scientists, assuming I'm defining science the right way. Christians. So, at what stage in your lives did you become Christian? And also, while going through graduate school, how were you able to nurture your faith? I feel like this is something that would help us as grad students. Starting from
so, whether I was a scientist or not had very little impact upon my faith. Okay? Having said that, I've spent the last 50 years in 20 and 21st century American universities. and feel like an alien, pure and simple. So they didn't influence me, and I felt that what I influenced them very, very little. As far as my own faith journey, it's taken a lot of different twists and turns. In particular, when I was 40, something special happened. I won't go into it. But that had nothing to do with being a scientist.
I became a Christian my first year of graduate school through knowing what would be my future wife, and I think I grew a lot becoming part of the InterVarsity Graduate Fellowship at Berkeley, where I was going to grad school. That was important. And then I think I really grew a lot more when I moved to New Haven and became a member of a smaller church, very, very vibrant church. And so I think that's the number one thing, advice I'd give is just make sure you invest in a church community heavily, even as a grad student. I think that's where you'll grow most. That's good advice for everybody. And as for being a scientist, I think I would definitely, I think of all people, scientists should be able to give reasons for their faith, like evidence, no basic apologetics, because people are going to assume that you have a compartmentalized, I have my religion, I have my science, and there's no relation at all. I believe things because I believe them because I was taught them by my pastor. I just believe him, but it's totally unrelated to what I believe about the real world. And so, unfortunately, many Christians do live with that compartmentalization, and unfortunately, we can too. And I would just really, of all people, we ought to be the ones who can give a reason for the hope that is in us.
Yeah, I want to say one thing. When I say my science, such as it is, didn't affect my faith, that doesn't mean that my science doesn't enhance my faith. The more science I know, the more amazed I am, the more I want to glorify God because I understand His creation better.
Preach on, brother, preach on.
Yeah, so I became a Christian in high school. I had gone to church because my parents dropped me off at church so they could have their Sunday mornings to themselves and my siblings. And I was in a dynamic high school youth group, and at some point I had to address the question of whether God really existed or not, because I've learned all this stuff, and so I did it. I'm an experimentalist. I did the experiment and got the answer. But that's more than a 2-minute story. So.
This brings us to the conclusion of our discussion. Our time is fast spent, so thank you very much, panel, for. At this point,
anybody who wants to talk about this stuff.
Yes. You are welcome
one-on-one.
To meet with any of the panelists offline.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
Yes. At this point, I will turn over to Colby, who has some announcements for us.